Welcome to my Learn to Play video on Archipelago. I'm going to teach you how to play, showing you how the game is set up, the rules, and how the game works. After this video, you should be able to play at home with your friends. Here's what the instruction book looks like. I'm going to go through all the necessary rules for you to play, but I encourage you to go home and read the rules afterwards, because seeing it, hearing it, reading it reinforces your knowledge on how to play. So let's take a look. The first thing to do is figure out how many people are playing. If less than 4, you need to place the 2 to 4 player side face up of the action wheel. If 5, then flip it over. Note that the purple is reserved for the 5th player. Next, separate the colored cubes, which represent the different resources you're going to collect during the game. Each color goes into one of these 6 slots in the box's insert. I recommend keeping the colors in that order because you'll find out it'll help gameplay go a little bit smoother. The insert will also hold other items during gameplay, such as the explorer tokens, money, evolution cards, and building tiles. Create 3 stacks of 8 explorer tokens and then put them in the box right here where they go. Now separate the money tokens into the $5 amounts and the $1 amounts and put them here in the insert. This is the evolution deck. You want to make sure that they're all facing the exact same way regardless of what it's saying. Shuffle it up, and that also goes right here in the insert. Lastly, there's a place in the insert for the building tokens. So if you want to use that, you can. And it goes right in there. And with this, you're almost ready. Place the box like so with this section here for the evolution cards. And you want to deal out 5 face up along the top. So they're all facing the upright position. Orientation of the cards is very important because later they'll end up rotating and it'll change their values. Then you want to go ahead, place the domestic market, the export market, the colony stability board, and the available workers board. Now place the given resource for each of the markets in the top left corner. And that's what the domestic market will start with. Nothing starts on the export market to start the game. Now every time you add a cube, it'll always go from the top to bottom and then left to right. And later you can see that depending on the row that they're in, the value of it will be different, and also some effects will happen later on. Now go ahead and place the meeples on the board as you see here. The white meeple is the population of your colonists. The black meeple represents the rebellion currently, and the gray meeple is the available workers. They all start at 0. Now each player will take the meeples in pieces according to the color that they've chosen, along with their player sheet, the screen. And some of the meeples and pieces you have are your people, ships, your turn order track, and a number of action discs. Those are going to be how you do a number of the actions in the game. At the beginning of the game, each player starts with 10 florins. Now we need to decide randomly the turn order. I always recommend just taking the turn order pieces and dropping them randomly one by one to determine player order, and then they go on that turn order track that you see. So this will go first, then second, and that's the first turn order. At this point, you're ready to shuffle up all the trend cards and draw one at random and place it face up, and that will be the victory conditions, not in-game conditions, but rather how you can get points when the game ends. In addition to that, you'll have 3 stacks that you'll want to shuffle of a short game, medium game, and long game objectives. So let's say we went for a medium game. Shuffle it up. and deal out one card for every player. So on the back of these, the top part is the ending the game conditions. Once this happens, the game ends. But because these cards are dealt secretly to each player, only you know that specific condition. And on the bottom is whenever the game ends, all players will get scored based on that condition. The game's going to start with the open ocean tile as the center board. Every player will place one of their ships in the center to start the game. Then you look at all the tiles, shuffle them up, and deal 3 to each player. And as long as they're able to play one of them, they are now allowed to play in player order their tiles. And the tiles will be placed adjacent to the open ocean space. They have to always make logical sense. So water has to go to water, land has to go to land, and as you can see, that would be a good starting position. And now, after the player places their tile, they go ahead and move their ship to the tile that they placed. Be careful not to cover up any of the resources, because the fish are a resource. And then they can move 2 of their meeples onto the land. Again, not covering up any of the spaces. As part of the first turn, where you place your first tile adjacent to the open ocean, you also collect a resource. One goes to the domestic market and one goes to you behind your player sheet. So in this case, the player could choose to collect a pineapple or a fish, and whichever one they didn't would go to the domestic market. And in addition, if there are any tiles that are discovered that have huts on them, you move the available worker meeple up that many spaces. And also, because we've placed our first meeple citizens, which are our colored meeples, the white marker will go up. So in a 3-player game, since you start out with 2 meeples, that's goes to 6. In general, as a rule, there's always going to be 5 things on each tile, except for the volcano. And if you see, like on this one, there's 3 resources, so that means there's going to be 2 huts on that tile. So you know that the available workers goes up to 2 here. And you do this for each player's turn, increasing the population and marking the available workers by the number of huts that you found. The unused tokens that were not placed at the initial setup are now discarded and shuffled into the stack of tiles. Now the stack should always remain in the insert here, and whenever there's an exploration action, the person can look only at the top tile. When they take a tile, they can either take this one or the one below it, knowing that you can place the either side on the board, but you only have knowledge of this one tile. So it's up to you. You choose before you look or pick it up. Throughout the game, there'll be different events and actions that can move this black meeple along the counter. And if it ever passes where the white meeple is, which is your population, then there is what's called a war of independence, and the natives are angry and they win. So it's a semi-cooperative game where if this happens, everybody loses. The other way that you can win is if there's one of your secret objectives is a separatist, then basically you act as a traitor, and when this happens, you're the only winner. Otherwise, the end condition of anyone's secret objective will dictate the end of the game, and whoever has the most victory points will be the sole, what they call the grand winner, but that's the best outcome for everybody. On the back of every player's screen, there's some reminders here. On the left, you see construction costs. So these are the resources and money that you pay to build each of these different items. You've got on the right side what happens if you do the taxation action, which I'll explain in a little bit, but you gain money for each of these that you control, including meeples and temples, towns, ships. But when you tax the the natives are unhappy, so you move. This is the sign for moving the black meeple token for the rebellion, and that increases by 1. And in the center of your screen, you've got the 6 phases of each round. You've got disengagement, order of play, population effects, balance of the archipelago, actions, which is where you take pretty much the majority of actions in the game, and then the card purchase. So the first step of the round is disengagement. Now we don't have to do this the first round of the game, but in future rounds you'll have potentially meeples on different resources on the board or buildings. Those are then considered engaged and they're occupied. So that when they're doing those actions, they've collected resources and things like that, and then they're engaged, so they cannot do anything else. But during disengagement phase, that's where they come off of these spaces and get ready to be used again for the next round. And if you had any evolution cards in front of you, those would also be untapped. So this is an example. This icon here means that anybody can tap this card for $1 and do this action. So if this card is tapped in front of you during disengagement, you untap it and be ready to use it again. And the other thing that happens is if there's any laying down meeples, those are considered rebels. But if during disengagement they're still laying down, so you can stand them up. After disengagement, then you do the order of play every round. The way that works is everybody basically bids how much money to be the person to choose the turn order. So secretly, everybody picks anything from nothing to however much they have that they want to bid, knowing that whether you win or lose the bid, you will lose the money. It goes back to the bank. But you put it in your fist, everybody has their fists out, and when that happens, everybody shows their hand, and whoever bid the most amount of money will then get to decide player order. And it's usually very good to go first in this game, but there's a lot of discussion that goes back and forth. There's a lot of trading and bargaining and negotiation in this game. So perhaps you'll put yourself first, and then the player to your right says, well, I'll give you this resource or this amount of money if you'll place me second. So then, those sorts of discussions are definitely supposed to happen in this game. But you go over to the turn track and go ahead and move those turn tokens into the order and get ready to continue with play. So the next thing to happen after order of play is population effects. So you look at these 4 boards and you look on the resources and which rows are shown for every single resource for every single market, and see how it impacts the population tracker here with the rebels as well as the available workers. So if this were filled up as an example and it went down to here, you can see that this has a symbol here for plus available worker. So then you would just move the available worker to the next number, and later when someone goes to recruit or hire a worker, now they are on another row, so they're going to be worth a different amount of money every time. And it could be the case that down here there's the plus sign for rebellion, so you increase the rebellion track with the black meeple based on how many add it up across all the markets. So if it were down here and that was the only one, then you would just increase that to 2. After population effects comes balance of the archipelago. Here's where you look at that stack of evolution cards. The top refers to the domestic market, the bottom refers to the export market, and if there's any red, then you ignore it during this phase. But in this case, on the top, we have a crisis to settle. So what happens is all the meeples, all the citizens will lay down, face down on the map, and in order to stand them up again, you've got to pay a cost. So in this case, if anyone pays 1 fish resource or a blue cube, you can stand up to 5 citizens. But they don't have to be just yours. They can be anybody's, but you certainly will negotiate with people whether or not you want to help them, because it's going to start with player order, and the first player will decide, well, I don't have any fish, but I see there's a fish resource in the domestic market, so at no additional cost you can take one of the fish resources from the domestic market to pay for this cost, and you can then stand up those meeples. The reason you want to stand them up is so A, you can use them later, and B, so that they don't count as rebels. And the reason is every rebel will increase the rebellion track marker by 1 per meeple. Now, as an example on this card, the export crisis also happens. So this one says rebellion will go down 2 for every temple that was built. So you just look at the map, and for every temple, you decrease the rebellion track by 2. If it were the case, as I mentioned, that there's a red threat on the card, during this phase, you ignore it. You'll get to that later. Alright, so the next thing after you balance the archipelago is where you take the meat of the game, which is the actions that you can do. Starting with the first player, you do 1 action, and then it passes to the next player in the turn order. So we look at the action wheel for all the available actions that you can do. Now at the start of the game, you get these action discs, and you only get 2 until a certain point where the explorer tokens those stacks are depleted, but I'll explain that a little later. Around the board, there's 6 actions that allow you to collect resources from the map. So you can place a disc here to collect the fish resource, here to collect pineapple, wood, steel, stone, and cows. And there's no limit to how many discs can be placed there. Now, also, you can do a construction action. As I mentioned before on your player sheet, this shows you the costs of the action of every possible building or port or ship that you can build, and you just take take the required resources and money from your personal supply, pay it to the bank when you take this action, and then you get one of those items, and it'll go on space on the map where you currently have a presence already, whether that be a ship or a meeple. The next thing over here is the transaction. So with this action, you can do 1 buy or sell action on the market. So when we looked back over at the import or the domestic and the export market, you can either place a new cube from your supply onto the track and then collect money based on the row that it's on, or if you're buying them, you can take one off the market for the cost on the row. So buy or sell, this allows you to do one of those. Down here is the migration action. If you place a disc here as an action, you can move all of your meeples 1 tile over. And we can talk more about movement in a minute, because there are some caveats with crossing water. but basically all of your meeples can move to one tile adjacent. Over here is where you can recruit workers. So when we looked at the track that has the recruit, well, the track with the unemployment, as long as there's at least one, you can buy or pay for somebody to join your cause. Basically, that means you pay and you get to add a meeple to the board. There is a maximum of 3 meeples you control per tile. So with that limitation, you can place your new workers anywhere. Over here, there's another way to gain a worker, and that's reproduction. So you can only do this once per round, and you place it on the color-coded spot for your associated color. So by placing it there, if you have exactly 2 stood-up meeples on the map, they can produce a 3rd meeple as an action, which is also stood up. Of course, it has to be exactly 2, and the 3rd one then maxes out that tile. This space down here, anybody can take them, but it can only be done 3 times per round, which is, you can see the multicolor means anyone can go there, but there's only 3 spots. And that's the taxation. Taxation, again, is where you collect money from the bank based on what you control, both meeples, ships, towns, and temples. And the last one that you can do on these actions is exploration. So you've got first to place an action disc on your own colored disc spot, and after you do that, you can do the action again as long as one of these 2 spaces are still open for anybody, but you can't start by placing them here. You have to start on your own color. And by doing an explore action, you can move a stood up unengaged meeple to an adjacent tile. And the tile, when it's placed, has to make sense logically, land to land, water to water, mountain to mountain, and also you have to move one of those available meeples onto the new tile. And those are your basic actions. Now, there's also markets on the board. There's the domestic market representation here and the port. These are only used when you are engaging a particular building. So if you look on the sheet down at the bottom, you play an action, or you can use a character or progress card, or use a market or a port. So if you have one of those buildings, you can place a meeple on them and pay 1 florin, and it goes on the board. For instance, if you did a port action to engage with the export market, you place that on your colored ship to indicate you're taking the action, and then it allows you 2 buy and sell actions instead of the 1. But the benefit is you're not using a meeple to necessarily activate it, or an action disc, excuse me. You're using a meeple instead of one of your action discs. The other thing you can do is engage the domestic market by placing another florin on your color in the market, and then again you can do 2 buy sell actions in the domestic market. So that's what those 2 building tiles do. During exploration, once you uncover the tile and place it, if it's successful and you've moved your meeple there, you also gain the exploration token. Now on the back you can see it's got this little question mark with all the resources. So this sits behind your screen, and you can use this to either satisfy some of the balance of the archipelago requirements for any resource, or you can use it when you're constructing things and have to pay a resource. So if it's one that you don't have, you can use this like a wild card. The other thing about the exploration tokens, remember in the insert of the box, there's 3 stacks of 8. So if any one of those stacks is depleted, everyone immediately gains 1 extra action disc that they can immediately use that round. So you're slowly gaining up to 5 action discs that you can start using in the game. So let's say you're blue on this turn and you decide to take the action of collecting the resource for cows. So you have your 2 meeples on this particular tile, which has a resource on cows twice. So each of your meeples, when you take the action, can be placed on there to engage it. And then for each resource that you do that for, you get 1 cube from the bank that you can keep. You can only choose one particular resource when you do that action at a time, but across the map, if you have multiple meeples that are able to engage a resource that you're collecting, in this case cows, they can all do it when you take that action. As another example of movement, if instead you decide to migrate, all of your guys can move 1 space, but there's water, so they have to have a ship. Each ship that you have, basically when you're using it to sail across meeples, they go on the edge between 2 tiles, and it allows them to transport the meeples across. And that includes multiple tiles, so you can convoy them together as one movement for those meeples. And after the ship does that action, or before, you can also move the ship as its own movement. So whichever way it is to help you, because if you're here and you don't have your ship, you can move your ship here first, then later, or secondary, you can then move your meeples now that your ship is in place. Make sure they're stood up. If you take the construction action, you have to place the building or port or ship on a space that your meeple already exists on that same tile. Here you can see the port, which has to be built on the edge of land and water. And again, you can use it by moving a meeple to engage it. And as I mentioned before, then you place one florin on the action wheel, and you're able to execute 2 transactions on the export market. The market, which is this space, works similarly, where if it's built, but every other building has to be on land, you engage it with a meeple, and now you can, as another action, do 2 transactions, buy or sell, on the domestic market. The temple, when you engage that, it allows you to be prevented from the balance of the Archipelago stage, where you lay down your meeples. The other cool thing is any meeples that were laying down on the tile during that phase, you can stand up any number of them on the tile if you control a temple. Note also that there can only be 1 type of each building per tile, so you can't have 2 temples on a tile, as an example. And then we come to the most interesting building that you can have, which is the town. So if you build a town and occupy it, you control the tile. So everyone else has to ask you permission if they want to collect resources and engage any of the resources on the tile. They have to ask your permission. Or you can also use any of the ports or markets that are on your tile if you control a town on that tile, effectively giving you total control. Now, if somebody were already on this market space and they don't move away, they can still use it without your permission. But if they ever are laid down, then the other player on the town can then kick them out of the building. And also, if they ever leave the building, they can never go back into it if there's a town occupied like this. So everyone has to ask permission of the person controlling this tile via the town. That's an overview of how the different buildings work, and of course there's the construction of the ship, which you just place in the water in the tile that you placed it, or in a tile where you've got an unengaged meeple. So moving on to the evolution card purchase, you look at this table here with the open cards available to buy. And first, you can either do one of 2 things. You can buy one of these cards paying the cost where the arrow's pointing to the bank, and then rotate another card 90 degrees, or rotate 2 cards 90 degrees. And it's always clockwise. You can see that the arrow points to the cost here, but every time you rotate it, it changes the cost. So it went from 3 to 5 on this one. If it ever goes around so that the arrow now points at a skull, it's discarded from the game. And then you'll replace from the top of the deck a new card. So your 2 actions again are rotate 2 cards or buy 1 and then rotate 1. If by purchasing a card and refilling a card, or by discarding a card because it went to the skull icon, the top of the deck now presents a red crisis threat, you do resolve those immediately. So it's possible to have multiple threats to resolve before your turn is over. So in this case, you look at the top part of the card, and then you have to resolve any of the red. So it says you decrease the rebellion track for every temple on the map. And there's others, so it just kind of depends. So let's look real quickly at the 3 types of cards that you can purchase. You've got progress cards, character cards, and wonders. And you'll note that by the construction symbol here. All of these cards are always placed in front of your screen, and so all players are able to see what cards you have, whereas your money and any resources you've collected always stay behind your screen. So this particular card has an action with a colored arrow. Let me see if I can get that in focus. So the colored arrow means that any player can actually use this, even if you bought it and it's in front of you. But in addition to paying the cost here of $1 to the bank, they pay you 1 to you to use it. So there's that little benefit. But the arrow means tap it to use it, so then you do the action. So this one says you can perform 1 migration action without spending an action disc. So that's an extra action for free that you don't have to spend a disc on. This is a character card. The Explorer has the same colorful arrow, so anybody can use this for an additional $1 paid to the owner. It says during exploration, take the first 3 hexagons from the deck and choose 1. Discard the other 2. So he helps you find better tiles that can hopefully fit where you're moving. Because when you're exploring, if you can't place the tile logically to an adjacent tile that your meeple's on, then you forfeit that action. You are unable to do it. And lastly, the wonders. These typically add victory points to your score at the end of the game, but they have a cost. So you purchase it, and then as an action, you place 2 action discs, and you also place 3 stone and have control of a temple, and then you can gain this benefit of decreasing the rebellion track per every temple. And by having this card at the end of the game, this little icon means you'll get 2 victory points. If there's ever any question of what action or icon means on any of the cards, just refer to the rule book. There's a glossary, as you can see. I'm not going to go through it all, but just show you that it's there. And also there's a card glossary for all the characters and cards that you can purchase here, and all the objectives, which is nice because that way you don't have to show your objective card that we discussed when you're trying to figure out what it is you're trying to accomplish. So just, I would recommend passing the rules to everybody so they can kind of identify which card they were, they have in their possession to end the game and to score with. And it's handily on the back of the manual. So that's my recommendation. So that's the end of the video. That's how you play Archipelago, the board game. I think I've covered everything that you need to know to play. If I've missed anything, let me know in the comments. As always, read the rules and let me know anything I need to update. But I hope this is enough for everybody to have a chance to play, because this is a very fun game and I recommend it. Thanks again. Goodbye.